Good morning, welcome. I'm Michael Lumpkin, Director of AFI Docs. Thanks for joining us in day 2 of the AFI Docs Forum. We have a great lineup of discussions and content today at the forum, and I want to give a huge thanks to the Corporation of Public Broadcasting for sponsoring the forum and the festival, so thanks to CPB. Today's programming was put together by Michonne Boston, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the AFI Docs CPB Public Media Forum. I want to welcome everyone who is here with us today, as well as our audience on OV, who are going to be joining our conversation online. So this event is being streamed live. We are kicking off today's forum with Truth and Storytelling, Docs and the Media in Post-Truth World. I want to introduce our moderator, Andi McDaniel, who's right here, and she will introduce the panel speakers. Andi is Chief Content Officer at WAMU, Washington, D.C.'s NPR station. She oversees the station's national and local news, talk programming, podcasts, and new content, including NPR's 1A, I have to say it that way, with Joshua Johnson and The Big Listen. Before we welcome Andi, I want to make a reminder that we need all the Wi-Fi we can get today. So if you can refrain from using the Wi-Fi here in the venue, that will be most appreciated. Thank you very much, so that people can see today's panels. So thank you, Andi, and I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good morning. I'm really excited to dive into this panel. This is a topic a lot of us are thinking about and tweeting about and chatting about, and we have a tremendous wealth of experience and expertise in this group, and I'm going to do my best to dig deep into it. And it really spans a lot of different disciplines. So first I'm going to introduce you to the gang here, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about how we're going to dive in. So right here to my left is John Yang, who is a correspondent for PBS NewsHour. He is an American Peabody Award-winning television news correspondent. Before NewsHour, he was a Chicago-based correspondent for NBC News, reporting for NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, and has a tremendous body of work, including reporting in April 2011 on tornado devastation that received an Edward R. Murrow Award for Best Newscast. He was part of the team that did that. So we're really excited to have him here. He is in the news universe and probably not getting enough sleep. So on his other side, we have Phil Bertelsen, who is a producer and director for Realization Pictures. Phil is an Emmy and 2-time Peabody Award-winning filmmaker. I hope you don't get tired of all the awards that are represented up here. So he's produced and directed a number of things, a couple just to call out quickly: a feature-length documentary special about the presidency of Barack Obama, a film called School of the Future about how science and technology are changing learning and teaching. And he's also produced and directed several episodes of Finding Your Roots, which we'll be talking a little more about today. And then continuing over to the left, Raney Aronson-Rath, who is the chief producer over at Frontline, if you've heard of it. So Raney is particularly known for her work really reimagining the work of Frontline across multiple platforms, which I can certainly attest is not an easy thing to do. So she has also an incredible body of work and is particularly strong in cross-platform and also in partnerships, and has led partnerships with all kinds of folks, including ProPublica, New York Times, Univision. And also Frontline has won under her tenure every major award in broadcast journalism. So that's just a blanket kind of thing. Just think of them all, picture them, and she's got them. So, and then last but not least, we have Whitney Dow, and I hope I'm saying that right. We've only been corresponding via email, so.
Whitney Dow, you're saying? Right?
Dow, yeah.
Yes, Dow.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Whitney is going to be a really interesting part of this conversation. His experience includes a number of films. He directed films including Two Towns of Jasper and I Sit Where I Want, The Legacy of Brown versus Board of Education. He too has been recognized with the George Foster Peabody Award and the Alfred DuPont Award, among many others. And was also creator of the Whiteness Project, which is a multi-platform interactive media project, and is story director for Veterans Coming Home, which we're also going to be hearing more about. And Whitney has some really inventive approaches to production that are going to really get at this question of narrative and who owns it and how it's formed. So let's start with what's on everyone's mind anyway. John Yang, how's the news business?
It's actually, I think that, ironically, President Trump may be saving print media because you've got incredible increases in online subscriptions to the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. At PBS NewsHour, our viewership is up about 21% year over year. We still have a fairly small audience, but the commercial networks, for some reason, are down, which has surprised me. I thought that with the advent of Donald Trump, it would have gone up and stayed up because it was up very much in the campaign year, but ours has actually risen has grown over the campaign year. This topic of truth is always something that I think that is particularly relevant now, but it's never been irrelevant, I think, in our work. I go back, I'm an old newspaper guy. I used to work at the Washington Post, and Ben Bradley, whenever he was asked about the truth and do we publish the truth in the Washington Post, he said, no, we don't publish the truth. We publish what other people tell us and what of that we believe. But I do think that, it's sort of, we publish and we broadcast what we can confirm and what we are able to verify. It is based on a lot of times what other people tell us, but it's also based on what we read in documents and that sort of thing. But I think what has changed is how people react to that or respond to it, or how they view what we write, what we broadcast, what we say, what we all put out. We now have a president who campaigned against the media, and that's really nothing new. No politician has ever lost votes by running against the media, but he continues to complain about stories that he doesn't like as fake news. I mean, this morning he's been tweeting about, he says, I'm now being investigated by the man who told me, I'm now being investigated about firing the FBI director by the man who told me to fire the FBI director. So he's sort of turning on Ron Rosenstein now. I mean, the tweets are even something brand new. How do we treat the tweets? I covered White Houses back to, the first White House I covered was George H.W. Bush. I treat the tweets as official presidential statements. There are other people who think they're lesser because they're tweets. No, they're coming out, I was gonna say coming out of his mouth, but they're coming out of his thumbs. And actually, Sean Spicer the other day was asked at a briefing how we should treat the tweets, and he said he's President of the United States, and these are statements from the President of the United States. But I was going to say that there are things now that you've got this diversity of sources. You've got the internet. You've got partisan media, and if you take the long view, nonpartisan press is a uniquely American phenomenon, and really relatively recent. I mean, you go back in as recent as the 50s and the 60s, you see really partisan press. The Los Angeles Times in California, the Chicago Tribune, very strongly Republican, both of them. You've got broadcast media now. Fox has their spin on the news. You've got a whole broadcast group, Sinclair, which does things which trouble me, about stories that must run, stories that can't run. But I now hear people talking about things, reasonable people talking about things that I think just a few years ago would have been thought of as crazy conspiracy theories, and saying them with great sincerity and believing them.
So you've mentioned a number of things that have changed in the way that consumers are receiving information. And I want to sort of pivot that question to Raney and hear from you. What are you noticing is different about the way consumers are hearing stories and seeing stories, and how is that changing how you do what you do?
Oh, first of all, I love the way that you asked that, because I think that's crucial to understanding the new landscape that we're publishing into. So for Frontline, I can really only speak for what we do. We have multiple audiences. So we have an audience on social media. We have an audience that comes to our broadcast as it airs. You'd be surprised. Millions of people still watch us on television as it airs. In fact, more than CNN or Fox. So Frontline has a robust primetime broadcast, but we also have a streaming, many of you probably who stream us. So we have multiple different audiences, and what we find is they're different people. They're different generations. They have different political persuasions even. And we don't actually change the factual journalism that we share that we feel is fair and vetted. We do share things differently. So we are actively publishing natively on these different platforms at Big Film. We're publishing short form on Facebook that's actually native to Facebook by people who actually know how to make those videos. So we don't expect our documentarians to really know how to do that unless they want to know how to do it. In some cases they do, but a lot of times it takes a different storytelling technique on these platforms to do really well. I think what we're seeing is on our broadcasts and on streaming, we have a really divided and very partisan healthy audience, meaning they're very diverse in their opinions. About 33% of them actually self-identify as somewhat conservative even. And so we like that. We like to have this sort of conversation that's happening that's not inside an echo chamber. On Facebook, however, we're finding that you really do see more of a divide in partisan terms, and we're really trying to identify what's happening on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, and how do we break through that barrier of people all agreeing with each other, because the purpose of what we do is to create a conversation, and that's essential and vital to our democracy, so we have to remain trusted in that way, in my opinion, for Frontline, right? And that nonpartisan idea, the idea of that, which is recent, has always been at Frontline. So this isn't a new idea for us, and holding on to that is, it's really essential to what I believe in. So we have different audiences, and it's really, really important to note who is where and when and how, and get to know them.
So Whitney, I want to go to you and take a little different angle here. So I think for our day-to-day newsmakers, the question of narrative is a little different maybe than it is for long-form documentary, because of course the shaping of the narrative takes such a long arc. You've done a lot of really inventive work in the field as it applies to kind of how different people interpret a historical event. What have you known all along that we're all now just kind of figuring out?
I love the way you framed that question. I think that, from the very beginning of my career, I was sort of confronted with this idea that there's multiple narratives. And the first film I did was Two Towns of Jasper, about the murder of James Byrd. And what struck me, what the whole construct of that film is, I went down there, and those of you who may remember, there was a black man in Jasper, Texas, who was chained to the back of a pickup truck and dragged to death by 3 local white men. And I went down there, and the first thing that struck me was the multiple narratives in the community, is that the white community had a fundamentally different truth about this event than the black community. And as I talked to both people, and it's funny when you talk about a black community and the white community when it's actually a town of 7,000 people, as if it's not one community. It's sort of a strange feeling, but I realized that there was no way that I could tell a single story. And so my response to that was I partnered with a friend of mine, Marco Williams, a black filmmaker, and we created 2 different crews. One was a black crew that only talked to black people, and one was a white crew that only talked to white people. And we spent a year in the town documenting the 3 trials that took place and trying to understand it. And what was really fascinating about this whole process is we realized that when we got to the editorial process, we couldn't agree on reality. There were fundamentally different realities in almost every situation. And so we started getting to this, trying to like, how do you then represent something that actually is unrepresentable? And so going forward, I've really carried that idea with me through all my productions going forward, is that trying to build production teams and production processes that are constructed on my understanding that my narrative is necessarily faulty. And so that I build a production team that has multiple viewpoints. And you know, there's a lot of talk in our community about diversity and the importance of building diversity in teams, as if it's something that's a good thing to do. And I've always sort of said, well, as a purely selfish, narcissistic person who wants to take credit for other people's work, the best thing to do is to build a really complex team that produces really good work. And you can't produce good work unless you unless you really understand that you have that you have multiple narratives in the context of what you're dealing with. And so this idea of, it was funny when I looked at it and said, oh, it's this post-truth world. We've always been living in this post-truth world. If you've been living in this country, the narrative of a white American is fundamentally different from the narrative than any other American in here. And it's a true narrative for yourself, but it's not the only narrative.
I think we're all really excited to see the documentary that you make about this moment in history. I'm just imagining the two production teams that you might put. Yeah. And an idea was born. So over to Phil. You recently made a documentary about Obama's presidency. I'm curious if what's kicking up in the landscape today is making you think about how much of this zeitgeist was present then, and what some of the early signs were that this problem of how different people are interpreting what's happening in different ways.
Wow. I mean, I think my most distinct impression during the process of making that film happened just after the election. Because we actually did a whole series of interviews on election night where everybody was...
This is the first election.
Yeah, this was 2016.
Oh, I see.
And Hillary was running, obviously, and people we were interviewing were literally going to a celebration that night. And so the mood in the room was giddy. And then, you know, we had about 3 days of shooting subsequent to that, and it was like we had walked into a wake, you know, everywhere we went. I say that because I think there was a presumption that she was going to continue his legacy and that it was intact, and that we being the liberal left-leaning media would go forward and continue to kind of represent our own truth. So it was quite devastating, but it was an opportunity for people to kind of almost have a catharsis around what their view of the world was and what they understood it to be, and what the reality of the events that occurred had told them. So there was a lot of soul searching. I think there continues to be. You know, what does that say about truth? I think at the end of the day, people have become kind of balkanized in their opinion and thinking and where they get their news sources. And so I think what ended up happening was that people were just going to the source that confirmed what they already believed. And yet there was this whole other reality out there. And so I don't know that it's changed people's way of receiving news or information, but it has certainly shown that some people mistake opinion for truth. And that's where the danger lies. And I think the two are maybe part and parcel of one another, but you know, one doesn't necessarily, you know, become the other. You know, I'm not sure I answered your question, but
you did. You did.
yeah.
As best as any of us can, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we're all feeling a little nostalgic for the Obama years, I have to say, these days. But
well, I think as journalists, we thought we knew what was going on. And I think there is sort of a beginner's mind now that we all that we all share, which that particular thing I think is probably really healthy.
Well, I do, and I think as journalists, we had to take stock over what it was we were doing. I mean, I do think we had a lot of people who felt that, you know, as journalists, we missed the story. You know, we were so busy paying attention to that bright, shiny thing, saying all those inappropriate things and making all those, you know, awful comments and gestures that we weren't reporting on this candidacy. We were covering it. We were giving it, you know, an open mic, unchecked, untethered, and this is the result. And I do think we as journalists, as storytellers, missed the story, and this is the subsequent, I think, result of that.
As a daily journalist, I wouldn't get too. I'm not too. I don't miss the Obama days quite as much as others might. I thought that every White House I've covered has closed off the press. I thought the Obama White House took great steps in closing us out, in going over our heads, using social media. I think that if journalists go to jail over leaks, I think you can start. I mean, the first journalists to go to jail in a long time over leaks were from by the Obama Justice Department. I just want to say it wasn't all in sort of all nostalgic and retrospect. It was not all rosy.
As I say, well, that was an opinion, not my personal truth.
That was an
personal
editorial. Oh, we're already erupting into fake news accusations. So while we're feeling maybe a little crappy about some of our shortcomings in terms of covering the unfolding narrative, certainly of the 2016 election, here's something to feel good about. I cracked up at the Huffington Post headline, PBS NewsHour is unexciting and even-keeled, and people are loving it. Which I got to tell you, that's a free ad campaign right now. Unexciting and even-keeled. New branding. So are we in a golden moment for public broadcasting? And what's our responsibility?
Oh, God, I hope so. No, I mean, as I say, our viewership is up, our not only for the broadcast, but online. I think our page views are up 55% year over year. I think that, and this is anecdotal evidence, something I always say that politicians fall into prey to when they talk about the huge crowds at the end of a losing campaign. When I run into people on the streets or at airports and they recognize me, they used to say, "Oh, we love the show." Now they say, "We really appreciate the show." I think that there is a change there. I think that we do things without drama. Jim Lehrer used to have one of his rules of the broadcast was dare to be dull. I don't know that I would go that far, but I think that we do spend time, and we do, 7 minutes to talk about an issue, and I think that people appreciate what we're doing.
7 minutes, boy.
That's a lifetime.
It is a lifetime, and Raney, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how that is translating in your world. I think one of the things that's happening right now, at least one of the really positive things that's happening around journalism, is that people are coming to understand that it's really a job and that it involves a lot of homework, and there are a lot of really unglamorous steps before you publish the headline. You've been doing some work on sort of revealing more of what those steps are. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to, but I want to say one thing on the appreciation front. For years we've been talking publicly about the fact that disruption in 2008 led to thousands upon thousands of journalists losing their jobs, right? Mid-sized papers closing, local papers closing, and it just happened, right? It just disappeared, and a lot of the accountability journalism that we came to take for granted is now gone. gone, right? So a lot of people ask, how could that be? How did that happen? Well, they lost their jobs almost 10 years ago, right? And since then, newspapers, which are a huge engine of journalism for filmmakers, right, and for big TV shows like Frontline and the NewsHour and others, disappeared from the landscape. And now all of a sudden, people are saying, hey, what happened to local journalism? What happened to those mid-sized papers that used to hold politicians to account, but also, you know, local government needs to be watched, but also many other social issues that got ignored along the way, right? So this is something that I find really encouraging, because I haven't heard this and I've been talking about it forever. As some of the people in the audience know, I am not, this is not fake. I've been saying this for almost 10 years, that this matters to journalism, that all these local reporters lost their jobs. But to your question, so I think one of the biggest things that I've been focusing on lately is trust, this idea that there was such a lack of trust, especially in East Coast media. Frontline has this great history of publishing already many of our really great transcripts and things that go along with our films. So we're starting a big experiment. We're calling it the Frontline Transparency Project, which is what you're referring to, which is actually now an interactive opening of our notebook. And what we're going to try to do, and we've released a couple of these already, is actually take our scripts from our films, and then we're going to source for you how we came to this conclusion. And the reason for doing this is not just because it's a cool digital tool, which it is, by the way. It's so cool. And it works, and you can share it, and it's digitally native, and it's easy to share. But more importantly, that if you want to know how we constructed an argument or how we came to a conclusion, we're going to walk you through that process. You see other newspapers and other big news organizations starting to do that, where they say, how do we know, or what do we know, or how much do we know? And the reason for that is because we're trying to build a dialogue with our audience, which is very different than times in the past. I think you just assumed trust, right? The assumption is trust. And I think now, if we want to reach across the divide, whatever side of the divide you're on, it's essential that journalists say, this is how we came to this conclusion, so that people who maybe don't trust you can understand, or at least come to their own conclusion, which sometimes isn't what you want, but sometimes they'll disagree with you, but at least make them be privy to that process. So this is a really big new idea that we're launching, and we're going to pilot for a year to see, do people really use it? Do they like it? Do they share it? And how do we feel as journalists? Was it too much work, or did it really have the benefit that we hoped for?
So I want to continue with the thread of sort of how we might change our process to continue to build trust with audience. And Whitney, I'm going to go to you, and we're going to play a clip here from the Veterans Coming Home project, and I'm pointing at it like it's going to magically happen, and I think there's a really capable staff here, and it's just going to go. So I wonder if you could just introduce this clip from Veterans Coming Home, which will give folks a little background, and then we'll dive in.
Well, I mean, this clip is sort of interesting because it represents a lot of the ethos that I try and work with. The Veterans Coming Home project, for those of you who don't know, was an initiative by Corporation for Public Broadcasting to do sort of a macro, multi-platform storytelling project about the military-civilian divide, looking at how what's the relationship between the 1% of the people that serve in the country and the 99% that don't. And when we started looking at all the media that was being produced, it was all sort of one-sided. It was stories of veterans, stories, military stories for the public to consume, as if they were in this passive position. And you know, like most things, I'm always like, you know, one of my like stock lines is I'm more interested in perpetrators than victims, and perpetrators are more interested, and they control. And so, how do we bring the civilians into the conversation? And so, we built a production process. We went out and we got a bunch of different filmmakers, young filmmakers, with really diverse backgrounds. We took combat veteran filmmakers and put them with Occupy Wall Street filmmakers and super liberal filmmakers from Louisiana and religious, so that there was this built-in tension that the actual story we were telling, and at every piece of the production phase, we had combat veterans working alongside the journalists, the production process. So my coordinator on the project was this guy, Captain Mike Brown, this ex-Marine who ran sniper teams in Iraq. And he, he sat down for the interview and he said, well, I have 6 sniper teams and I move them around and I have to determine which building is safe, and we have a whole spreadsheet of how we figure out how we're identified. And I was like, this sounds exactly like production. This is going to be, this is going to be, and so that was part of our ethos, was to sort of have this built-in dialogical structure at every phase of the production. And then the other piece of it is something that I think that talking about partnerships, is also letting go of authorship. And so this piece that we're showing is actually a Vox video. And that this idea that we say, okay, we can do the reporting, we can create the media, but then we want to partner with people that already have a relationship with audiences and recognize that they understand how to take that information and put it into a language that will reach their audience. So this video doesn't really have anything to do with this production process that I talked about, meaning it wasn't shot by our filmmaking team. It wasn't, we didn't edit it. We wrote the script, gave it to Vox. We worked together with them to produce it. But it was part of our beginning. We created sort of a master narrative structure of questions that we were asking that we then sort of atomized. And this is like one of 150 pieces of media we produced over 3 months that kind of fit into that overarching narrative structure. So I don't know if that's a good setup or a too complicated setup, but anyway, this is what it is.
Let's take a look.
Here's America, and here are 100 dots representing 100% of the population. At any time, about 30% of the population has been considered eligible to fight on behalf of the country based on a shifting definition, but that number has been surprisingly stable. Here is the portion of Americans that served in the Revolution, and here's how many Americans served in the Civil War and World War I. World War II was our peak at 17%, over half of the likely eligible population. During Vietnam, fewer served. Today, the portion of Americans who served in the global war on terror, America's longest war, mostly in Afghanistan and Iraq, is down to less than 1%. So where are we now? Civilians and the military are simply getting further apart. While 76% of Americans over 65 say an immediate family member served, the same is only true for 33% of 18 to 29-year-olds. And military service is becoming concentrated in fewer families. 79% of veterans have an immediate family member who served. Fewer of our leaders served than ever before, and none of the year's presidential candidates served. But having less veterans isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a direct consequence of ending the draft, which was a great idea for all sorts of reasons, from moral objections to involuntary service, to arguments economists made like average skill of soldiers and the cost of training. And the death toll of war has dropped dramatically around the world, so fewer soldiers are needed. But of course there are consequences. Veteran populations feel misunderstood and unappreciated. Stereotypes of veterans as either heroes or ticking time bombs dominate the media. And while phrases like "thank you for your service" and "we support our troops" are everywhere, for many veterans, this feels like a deflection rather than real recognition. Let's face it, most people don't think a whole lot about the men and women who fight our wars. During the 27 years of the draft, the military was deployed 19 times. In the years since, it's been deployed 144 times. And the burdens of these wars are shouldered on that ever narrower group of Americans, while the consequences of our modern war machine feel ever further from the rest of us. This video was produced in partnership with Veterans Coming Home, who are digging deeper into the civilian-military divide. Learn more at veteranscominghome.org.
Great piece. So, how did this work end up different because of the process that you took to get there? And how has the whole project turned out differently along the way?
Well, I mean, I think it was a combination of a couple things. The other thing that I didn't mention is this idea of data. And data is something that has become a bigger and bigger and bigger part of my work and all the work that I'm doing. My latest, the project that I started with POV on whiteness has morphed from a multi-platform storytelling project into the first study on how whiteness is constructed by a major research in university I'm doing with Columbia University. It's all data now. And I'm like in the back seat of it, coming up behind, trying to like interpret the data. So this was, I mean, the difference in this is a couple things. One is that the number of people who had eyes on this, even though I was like the lead creative on it and writing the script, that I had, I really put myself in a position of accountability to the entire production staff, that everybody has a chance to weigh in with different, you know, with their own perspectives on what they wanted to see, and so that it's not just me interpreting this story that I was very much involved in, but it's also all these other people like the Occupy Wall Street people and the combat veterans weighing in on what we were trying to say and why it was important to say it. So I think that it actually made it stronger that way. And the other big thing, as I said earlier, is this idea of letting go of authorship in this way. Of like, more and more I find myself creating stuff and giving it to people, and thinking of myself as a storyteller in how I can tell a big story, not that's contained in some 90-minute narrative, but it's actually how it then reverberates in the media sphere. And so this video has been viewed millions and millions and millions of times, far more than, you know, a linear film that I've ever created. And it's also puts it out there as a much less of a, I mean, I know, look, it's slanted, it has a liberal slant to it, it comes from Vox, absolutely, but it also has a lot of objective pieces to it that I think a lot of people can react to and process in their own way. So, yeah, so that's, I mean, so it really is sort of, it's one example of the structures that I've been trying to build in the storytelling that actually can help. I don't think you're like circumventing post-truth. You're kind of like embracing this, embracing the inherent tension of multiple narratives.
So as someone who myself is working within the news space, there are a number of things that you just said that give me thoughts about how we can do a better job making the story that we present day to day on air more authentic and really embracing that divide. I kind of want to pose that to our two sort of more short-term turnaround newsmakers. I'm curious what resonates about what Whitney's describing about his process, either Raney or John.
I mean, actually, what you're doing there is something Frontline's doing all the time now. I think it's really essential. One of the things that we should all just acknowledge is that most people are getting their news in younger generations on Facebook, right? So we need to be there as truth tellers, right, or as factual storytellers. We need to be on those platforms too, telling stories in a native form so that they're getting actual things that are real. So that may have had a slant, but it was factual, right? So what you're presenting is true in that sense, right? So I think that just making sure that we're in that environment, publishing not just the whole documentary film on that platform, right? But actually going to the platforms and saying, how do people take, like, that's a great example. Really, really smartly done, right? And people will watch that. It's short form. It'll grab you. And hopefully what we've seen with Frontline, a kind of amazing thing happening is that our Facebook now is our top referral to our streaming online for our full-length films. And so we've seen this major surge. It's in the 60 to 70% of streams, in large part due to the work we're doing there. So people get hungry for more. Like right now, I'm hungry for more. Do you guys all feel hungry for more? Right, that's because they do this great job of just making you feel like, you gotta know more, right? You're curious now about this essential truth of who is fighting our wars. So I think that's what we try to do at Frontline too. So there's a lot in that I love.
Can I just add one thing, do something really interesting there that I think is really important for everybody who's making stuff to think about, is that what you're doing, when you said that the referrals of your long-form streaming come from the short form, it's learning to think about your content in different iterations. That you're not, and this is what I think is a big responsibility of public media, that you're not doing the same thing online. You're not doing a short thing of the long thing you did. You're doing a fundamentally different thing, but it's the same thing. It's the same conceptual idea, but it has a different iteration for different audiences, different platforms, whether it's Snapchat or Facebook or Instagram, so that as a creator, it's the the thing that's really interesting that I've learned as a filmmaker is it's the same creative process. It's the exact same creative process to figure out what a photograph is that's a posting with a tagline as it is to make a 90-minute movie. It's part of the same process.
It's
Harder.
to tell a short story, right, as opposed to just an excerpt or an idea. So that's what we found, right? Is that short form is really difficult to do well. That's why you work with people like Joe Posner and others who are making these, right? To try to show you this new form, and then you embrace it, right? And a lot of younger filmmakers are all over this, by the way, so it's not rocket science, but it is really important to include younger generation storytellers because they're on it, they know it, they feel it. And then you can learn too, you know? I'm like mid-generation, but it's important.
Well, there's something else you're doing that we don't talk about a lot, excuse me, in the journalism business, and that is packaging and design. So that sort of visualization of data and, you know, creating these little atomized stories that are intended to be sort of marketed by people to their friends. They spread in part because they're so appealing. I think the kind of maybe the flip side of the dare to be dull equation is sort of, you know, dare to actually make even, you know, public broadcasting and documentary content kind of sexy.
No, I mean, I thought the graphic representation of the percentage of wars I loved. I mean, that's something that hearkening back to my days in commercial television, that we really worked very hard on. It's expensive, it's time consuming. We don't have, at the PBS NewsHour, we quite frankly don't have the technology to do that for a day of air piece.
Maybe not day of air, but maybe weekly. But you guys have some really strong visual storytellers now on the digital side.
Oh, absolutely.
And so does NPR. I mean, you have a whole new visual team. They're doing remarkable work in the same space as Vox and others, where I think, you know, younger, well, it doesn't even have to be younger. It just has to be visual and snappy and taking data to a new level, right? So telling a story with the data. So that was clearly a story that grabbed us. So it was based in data.
Yeah, and NPR has a photographer and illustrator who does a lot of their stories. You'll notice it makes you want to click. It makes you want to share it when there's a great visual adaptation. We just hired a visual editor who previously worked for National Geographic, and we're radio. So, you know, people are looking at stuff, and we're acknowledging that. Yeah.
I was just going to caution us to not assume because it's data, it's true. I think, you know, data needs to be interpreted, and you know, data told us, you know, the outcome of the election was going to be different. So I think we need to acknowledge that where the data is coming from, how it's interpreted, is also an important part of the truthful aspect of telling the
John's
story.
going to want to follow up on that. I can see he's itching.
Well, I think I think I mean, this may be going, we're maybe going off in a different direction here, but I think that the problem with the polling, the public polling in the last cycle, is that there were a lot of bad polls. I think that every small newspaper, every small station wanted a poll, and they wanted one as cheap as possible, and they had a lot of bad polls. And journalists, and this was journalists treated all polls as equal, which I thought was a mistake. And they didn't quite understand how the polling worked. Everyone thinks, and the Times Upshot did a great thing, is that they took the same raw polling data. I think a lot of people think that it's just accounting, that people just add up the numbers and here's the result. Gave it to 3 different pollsters, and because it's weighting, it's the sample, it's the projected who's going to turn out. Anyway, they came up with 3 very different very different results from that.
So we have another clip we're going to show, and it has nothing to do with polls. It's different. It's back to kind of this question of narrative. And in particular, Phil, this is from Finding Your Roots, which you've produced a number of episodes or segments for. And in this one in particular, we experience someone being confronted with a truth other than the one that they've always assumed or understood about his life. Do you want to share a little more before we go to that clip?
Yeah, I think you pretty much set it up perfectly. I'll just add that it wasn't a truth that he didn't know about. It was a truth that was not confirmed. It was a rumor. And if those of you who've watched this show know, it's a mix of personal narrative and data-driven narrative based on DNA. And so this is a clip from Ty Burrell's episode. Phil Dunphy, for those of you who watch Modern Family.
I don't know much about my father's line, so I'm very curious about
Ty
that.
told me something that I had never heard any white person say before. He said that when he was a teenager, he heard a family story that his maternal great-great-grandmother, a woman named Susanna Weeks, was actually a black woman.
I'm fascinated as a student of African American history. So you come home one day and your parents go, something we have to talk about. And you go, oh my God, they're getting a divorce. Tell me what happened.
Well, it wasn't a somber thing. My mom was like, we just found out some pretty cool stuff.
If this story turns out to be true, then that means that Ty's grandmother, Kathy Weeks, herself had a black grandmother.
My grandmother, then, after we said, is this true? She said, yeah, people used to come up to me and say, your grandmother is an N-word.
Wow, they did? That was cold.
But we were like, well, why didn't you ever tell us that? Why? But I think there was probably some shame there or something.
Yeah, somebody saying your grandmother's an N-word, it's not like...
She wouldn't pass that on to us.
But did you believe the story?
Well, I had a hard time, but I wanted to believe it was true.
To find out, we started researching Kathy's father, Ty's great-grandfather. His name was George Weeks, and according to the family story, his mother, Susanna, was black. In the 1930 census, we found George living with his wife and 6 children in Jackson County, Oregon, a remote farming region. Most importantly, the census listed George's race.
Weeks, George, age 65, white.
White. In fact, your whole family in this federal census is listed as, my father would say, white as the driven snow.
Right.
And the photograph on the left shows your great-grandfather, George.
Wow. But he doesn't look black.
Doesn't look like it to me, brother, and I'm always trying to recruit black people.
This wasn't surprising to me. Family stories are notoriously inaccurate, more often myths than historical facts. But as I looked deeper into George Weeks' past, I discovered something that did surprise me. Going back a decade, in the 1920 census, George wasn't listed as white.
Weeks, George, Mu.
Do you know what MU?
Mulatto?
Mulatto.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That is crazy.
You do have black ancestry. Your family story was true.
Wow. That gives me chills.
Ty Burrell, talk about a modern family, brother. Yeah. Sent here by Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, to welcome you. Welcome you
Thank
to
you so
the...
much.
And going back further, we found that George was actually listed in the 1900 census as a black man. That means that somehow, between 1900 and 1930, George's identity underwent a transformation from black to mulatto to white in the eyes of census takers.
So if we can't count on the census to tell the truth, what can we count on?
You know, trust your data. Be careful. No, I think it's interesting. You know, we're sitting here talking about post-truth. You know, we're also supposed to be sitting here in a post-racial society, and I think one of the things that show does so well is demonstrate that we're all part of this experiment together, and we all are tied to one another in ways that are not just local and neighborly, but genetically and physically and emotionally and psychologically. So this fabric of this nation that's so divided about, you know, what it believes and who to follow, you know, I think, you know, a show like that goes a long way in helping us check ourselves and understand that, you know, it's a little more complicated. Yeah.
So we're going to go to questions in a little bit, but I want to hear from each of you on one last question, which is really the question of at this moment when to some degree, journalism or truth or reality is in question or up in the air, or at least in a sort of chaos. What makes you optimistic about the future? What makes you, as you said earlier, Raney, what makes you optimistic that we can build trust back up?
Oh, I am just optimistic in my spirit. So, as an investigative journalist, however, I'm grounded in reality. I mean, if you just look at the actual facts, I do believe data needs to be interpreted. I assume that data was, right? Your data better have been. No, I'm joking. You know, I believe there's so much more for journalists to work with right now than ever before, right? There's so many different ways to publish. And so there was a time not long ago when I was inside network news where I was really worried about the future of the news industry. Just in general, I was worried about broadcast journalism. And now I feel, at least for a visual documentary, factually based investigative long form, I feel like what we do has such a rich, future, and I see it in all of the ways people are finding us and they're hungry for us and how long they're watching us. So we're not seeing people flip off when they're watching in the first couple of minutes. We're seeing people stay and send us their comments. I think the audience conversation is crucial, which we never had before. We really did broadcast from afar, right? And as the expert. And I think a lot of the themes you talked about really resonate with me, the idea of multiple narratives and truths and other people in the newsroom. That is my biggest optimism, is that people making the news are more diverse. There are more women. So it's diversity and also gender, not quite equality, but there are a lot more women involved. And I think that's making what we do better. And men are great too, don't worry. That's always important to say. But the point is that, I feel like we have more of a perspective that's coming to the front, and people like it, appreciate it, and are sharing it.
I would just piggyback on that to say I'm currently working on a film about the press and the civil rights movement. Talking to journalists, many on in years, about that age of reporting. And it was what some would consider to be a kind of a golden era on the part of the press, where they reported on a movement that led to just tremendous social change, in large part due to their reporting. When the headlines would hit the desk of the president the next day, John F. Kennedy would send his brother Robert down and, get it straight, kind of thing. That said, we're also talking to contemporary journalists who see this moment in this time very reminiscent of that time, where their role in the public discourse is such that they need to get it right, that they need to be on the front lines and putting themselves in the line of fire, as it were. And we see it time and again. Most recently, that journalist that was upended by a representative or congressional candidate who then won his election, but who, will still be facing.
His glasses can be visited at the museum.
Oh, really? They're there already?
Well-known fact.
There.
Yeah,
that was amazing. That was a good story.
I'm going there after this panel, actually, to see the camera of Moses Newson, who was a black journalist on the Freedom Rides, whose camera got left and incinerated in a bus that he fortunately was able to escape. So, it's interesting that they should be on display side by side.
So, Whitney, in addition to the documentary you're now going to do about Trump's America as seen through the perspective of multiple production teams, because we've assigned that to you, right? What else are you excited to tackle?
I'm also optimistic by nature. I mean, my wife says I'm unrealistic, but I always say, no, I'm optimistic. Two things that really make me excited are the conversations that seem to be opening up here. It's like we're on warp speed when you think about the type of conversations we're having in media now about whether it's it's gender identity or whether it's race. When I started the Whiteness Project 5 years ago, I couldn't say the words white supremacy in a pitch meeting without getting people like freaking out and throwing me out. Now that's sort of like, it's no longer. It is a pejorative term, but it's a descriptor that people are willing to discuss. So I'm really excited about, and the conversations that are opening up and people are ready to engage in on all these different fronts. The other thing that I'm really excited about is all the different formats ways to communicate that are out there. Is that this idea that somehow we're in this sort of dying tough world. We're in a world that's exploding with the communication, exploding with ways of talking to each other, exploding with how you can represent ideas and tell stories. And whether it's long form, people, something like a Snapchat project that I did that mixed long form and short form content, to like active killing, where people are ready to process content in different ways. And that, as a creator, as a journalist, is incredibly exciting.
Unexciting and even-keeled. What's the future of PBS NewsHour look like?
No, it is exciting. I think that everything that Phil and Raney and Whitney have talked about, the new tools, the new outlets, I think are very exciting. But what makes me most optimistic, quite frankly, I've been at this 40 years. What makes me most optimistic is to look around the newsroom and see, and also look at my inbox, my email inbox from fellow alums, from young people graduating. Really smart, smarter than I am, more creative than I am, more entrepreneurial than I am, eager to get into this business, to tell stories. That's what makes me optimistic.
Well said. So with that, I think we're going to open it up to questions. We've got a microphone circulating out there, if you want to just raise your hand.
I just want to, while we wait for someone to kind of piggyback on this idea of what the newsroom looks like today, and one of the conversations we keep coming back to in the making of this film about the press during the civil rights movement is one of perspective, and how important it is now to have diverse voices, diverse people represented in the newsroom, and how stories get interpreted, how data gets interpreted, is all through the lens of our historical and cultural experiences, not just as women, but as children of immigrants, as African Americans and descendants of slaves. It's something that really is what's changing the conversation, or what will, anyway.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot, learned a lot of good things. Like everyone else, I assume, I've been flipping through the catalog for the AFI docs, looking at the movies, thinking about what I can squeeze into just a couple of days. So I'm wondering whether you have done the same, if you have come across any films that you're interested in seeing, given your interest, the work that you do, and your background in this field.
Not especially. I haven't had that opportunity, but I definitely intend to once I get off this stage.
Maybe we'll turn the question around to the crowd. Are there folks who want to suggest specific films this weekend that maybe speak in some way to the questions that we've been talking about?
I think there's a film tonight called Suitable Woman that's airing. Anyone want to pitch their film? I mean, I know we got filmmakers in the audience. Now's your moment.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is, when we create language for something that hasn't existed before, like the idea of alternative facts or fake news or post-truth, what does that do to your work? How does it impact the way that you're able to convey truths or facts? And how does that just shift the way that you are able to communicate ideas now that there are these new terms, if at all?
I'm not sure alternative fact is a term, but they're trying to legitimize it as one. I think we do spend a lot of time chasing after this kind of inanity, like alternative facts, and treating it as a legitimate, concept. There's a fact, and then there's a lie. There's no alternative to the fact other than the lie. So I don't embrace that, and I try. I'm not in the daily practice of reporting the news, so it's different for me, and it's easier for me to make blanketed statements like that. But
well, it's a really interesting question, because I feel like the question of kind of how much do we come to, as media, how much do we come to sort of take on the language that has been adapted to describe some of these phenomena? And I think alternate facts is one of those. Fake news was one of those, and then has come to have a different meaning. We are using the terms, so how do you figure out how to do it without reinforcing some kind of falsehood, or to do it responsibly?
Well, I mean, the one thing I'm interested with what you talk about, there's truth and there's lies, but I have trouble with that because some of the things that some people at the White House and some of them who work in the Oval Office who were elected, some of the things that they say that don't seem to have a basis in fact, I think he honestly believes. So is he lying? Or I'm reluctant to say he lies when he says millions of illegal immigrants voted for Hillary Clinton and that's why she won the popular vote. I think we've gotten bolder in daily journalism by saying that there's no evidence, that it is a baseless claim. And I think that in the past, we wouldn't have even printed it because there was no basis for it, but I think now we are. And I just did a spot the other day on the Seth Rich case, the young DNC worker who was murdered here in Washington. There is a school of thought, there's a conspiracy theory that he was killed by the Democrats, by the Clinton campaign, because he's the one who gave Wikipedia the documents. There's no evidence for this. I played a clip from Newt Gingrich saying all this, and then followed it in track by saying, there's no evidence for any of what Mr. Gingrich just said. I didn't say he lied. I just said, we can't find any evidence for this.
So how do you decide how even-handed to be or how aggressive to be? I think there are those who would say, which he says, without evidence, seems pretty mild.
Well, it's funny because I go back to the, this is before PBS, this is when I was working at NBC, during the Obamacare, the American Affordable Care Act, when the Republicans started talking about the death panels, that the bill included these panels that would judge about treatment and and which drugs people could use, which, by the way, every insurance company has. And out of fairness, out of some, to me, this is an opinion, misguided attempt to be fair, we would report this, that this is what they're saying. I wanted to say there's no, but here's what this actually is. Here's what they're talking about. That it's something that every insurance company now has who determines whether or not they're going to pay for a treatment, they're going to pay for a prescription drug. I think now we are getting a little bolder than that. We are now sort of saying, I always wanted to say, not just report it, but just report it and say, it's not true. And it was harder back then to do that, and I think that President Trump, in an odd way, has made us bolder in that.
It's toughened us up a little bit in some ways. Yeah,
we have a question back here.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Sylvie Bello, the Cameroon American Council. As we talk about post-truth world and as we look at President Trump, as a black woman, as a foreign-born black woman, as a foreign-born black woman from Africa, as a foreign-born black woman from Africa whose country was colonized by France, one of the stories that I'm hoping could come out of President Trump's brash nature, the fact that he did not sign the Paris agreement for climate change, would be that maybe he can look into the fact that France still holds 16 countries in bondage. So one of the things, so my question is, what do you think can come out of a presidency that really doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks? One of the reasons why we were not very happy with President Obama, to your point about it was not all rosy, one of the things we're not very happy about President Obama is that America was a participating ally when France killed Gaddafi. And we feel like with President Trump, in addition to the many other things that he does that is not right when it comes to a liberal perspective, that maybe the fact that he doesn't need to be all buddy-buddy with the rest of the world, maybe he would look at France and tell them to stop taking money from poor African countries after they've been raping us and oppressing us for 500 years. So for you, what stories do you think can come out of this post-truth, and would the way President Trump is. Thank you.
So opportunities out of brashness.
Well, the idea of trying to find like what's the what's the silver lining is the question. I mean, I think that one of the things that is so clear, and I think that John touched on, everybody's touched on it, is that Trump's being in the White House has been like rocket fuel for journalists, and it's been rocket fuel to not be complacent, to tell new stories, to attack these existing sort of retell narratives. I mean, there was this really great editorial in the New York Times a couple of years ago that I took to heart that said, the organizing principle of the world is the denial of what you know to be true. And that really is kind of like, what you're talking about is that we have these, one of the things that I think it's done, I think, for journalists is that I think especially on the liberal side, we're living in this space of this tension between our narratives about ourselves and what we know to be the true narratives that's sort of tied to this idea of American exceptionalism. And anybody who's scratched the surface of American exceptionalism knows what a complicated and difficult construct that actually is. It's us being, you talk about France, but we talk about we're outraged at ISIS burning people in the public square in cages. Spend 1 minute on Google and you can find images of Americans burning other Americans in the public square. That's being covered by the news media and put on postcards and sent around in sort of an early Instagram form of like when people would publicize lynchings by photographing them. So I think that this is I think Phil said it earlier. We got complacent. I think that people who sort of consider themselves journalists and telling these stories have got really complacent over the last 8 years, and now this sort of put us on notice that we have to go after all these stories, and it's our responsibility to go after them and open them up. So I don't know. I have a very hard time imagining Trump caring about anything else outside of Trump, but he surprises me every single day, so who knows? He may want to go back and talk to France about what they're doing in Africa.
Well, he has gotten a lot of folks to stop behaving, and to include journalists. I think the kind of the quietness, the kind of let's play by the rules. It feels like everyone's willing to put themselves out there a lot more. There's another question over here, but I think we're missing a...
We just have one final
question.
Mine was kind of going back to the alternative facts thing, and it was for Whitney because I'm fascinated with the way you made your first film. I love the idea, I love the concept behind it, and I kind of wanted to hear, have you expand on how you feel about alternative facts, because you had two completely different realities. Does that fall under that category, and what's your position on that?
I mean, the idea that there isn't if anybody who's been in a relationship knows that there's alternative facts, right?
I just
yeah. Just from your mouth to Twitter's ears.
Yeah.
Wait, are we treating opinion as fact, though? I think we got to be careful.
We can all disagree. Agree to disagree.
Agree to disagree. Yeah, no. Again, I think I really put an incredible pressure on myself in the work that I'm doing to be representational, and that that recognizing the faulty nature of what I'm doing. I had this on that same film. I'll tell I don't want to wrap up a very brief story. I did a thing where I filmed this group of people in Texas, a group of black men who ran an auto body shop, and they told me all these stories about the story I was covering, all these things. And I had done such a great job. I went and I gained their trust. I got all this stuff. And then I said, Marco, you got to go down and talk to these people. They're really fascinating. He went down and he filmed them, and he came back, looked at the footage, and it was revealed that when they talked to me, they changed their names, they made up stories, their relationship to the murder, all these different things were fundamentally different. And it really hit home for me that intention matters for nothing. Your intention doesn't mean anything. And you have to keep that in the forefront of your mind, that when you're coming into these, in anything that you're covering as a filmmaker, that you're impacting it with your very presence, that you are the story. I mean, again, another thing I say, people say, what's the film about? I say, well, it's about me, right? It has to be about me because it is my interpretation of what it is. So, I mean, the last thing I wanted to say, I thought it was interesting when your question about, you know, fake news, it sort of struck me that fake news also has multiple narratives, right? Like fake news itself is, on one side, it's like news that we don't like, and on the other side, it's a real problem in social media. So it's sort of this like looking glass of, you know, this multiple looking glass of problems. How do you do it? It's complicated.
Isn't it important to parse out, and I mean, I understand the idea of different people having different perspectives and each of those perspectives being true, but isn't it important to parse out, for example, a lot of stuff that comes from the White House is deliberately misleading and baseless versus something that's a genuine alternate perspective? Like, I'm just, I don't want to give this White House too much credit for just, you know, saying that they're, you know, that attaching it to an alternate perspective when it's actually, a lot of the stuff is, at least from my perspective, is just like completely based on nothing.
Well, I think that's where like the role of what, you know, John does and Raney does is different from what Phil and I do, because I think that, yes, you have the opportunity to respond instantly to that and to talk to that. I mean, I think you were saying, how do you do it? I mean, what did Anderson Cooper say to Jeff Lord the other day? You know, you defend. Oh, yeah. So maybe you should try that. He said, you know, you could crap on the desk and you would defend him. So you know, but I think that we get this longer term thing of being able to try and understand what it is, because I also, you know, I believe in, you know, I have my own version of what I believe is truth, and I'm not sort of giving up and saying, well, hey, it's all just perspective. It's all just, you know, that there's these multiple things. I also feel like I'm trying to get at something by showing these multiple things. It gives people an opportunity to try and understand what sort of lies at the core.
And I think, unfortunately, we've tapped into a really rich portion of this conversation right towards the end. So thank you for that. And I guess you'll have to pick it up offline. But with that, I think we're going to close and thank our panelists for your work and for sharing.
All right, we're off to a strong start, aren't we? Thank you, Andy, John, Phil, Raney, and Whitney, for a very great conversation. I just want to remind everyone that our next panel will be documentary film in service of a civil society, starting at 11:30 a.m. So this is the time for you to refresh until that next panel. Also, a reminder to our OV audience to please tweet out the link to your friends and share it on Facebook so that we can bring more people into the conversation. And also, in response to your question about public media films that are in the festival, today we are showing Gentlemen of Vision after the case study, which will start at 4. So we're going to take a show of hands to make sure you have a reserved seat at that screening at 4 o'clock after the case study session. Also coming up in the festival, The Force will be shown on Saturday. For Akeem is today. Dolores, about Dolores Huerta, will be on Saturday. Bill Nye Science Guy, Sunday. Quest, Friday. And unfortunately, yesterday was What Lies Upstream, but because it's funded by public media, you will see it eventually. So thank you all, and thank you all our filmmakers in the festival. And join us again at 11:30 for our second session for the CPB Forum.